Ayan, sige. Thank you very much. May nakikita po kayo na aking notes?
Yes, sir.
Yan, salamat. Basically, ano lang ito, balangkas, introduction. No? And siguro mga ano lang ito, ilang minuto lang. Kasi mas interesado ako dun sa inyong sasabihin at maidaragdag no, sa aking nasimulan. Okay, so ang pamagat ng aking kasalukuyang proyekto ay ang etiko ng kahayupan bilang isang epistemolohiyang pagninilay. So, banggitin ko na ang konteksto. Ang proyektong ito sa ilalim ng RCCA ay isang pagsusog sa naunang saliksik sa kaparehong tema. Yung nauna ay ang epistemolohiya ng kahayupan bilang isang etikong pagninilay. Medyo may play of words, no? Pero banggitin ko dito. Mangyari, yun yung unang bahagi na nalathala nitong buwan ng Hunyo 2020 sa lokal na journal sa isang pamantasan sa probinsya ng Rizal. Doon aking ginamit ang empatiya sa konteksto at gawi ng mga hayop at ginawa kong basihan ng aklat na Wild Justice, The Moral Lives of the Animals. Isinulat ito ni na Jessica Pierce at Mark Beckhoff noong taong 2009. Dito kanilang pinatunayan ang tatlong larangan na kung saan masasabing ang mga hayop ay may angking kakanyahan. Hinati nila ito sa tatlong pangkat. Una ay ang cooperation cluster na kung saan nadyan ang altruism, reciprocity, honesty, and trust. Ang ikalawang grupo ay ang empathy cluster na kung saan metikulosong tinalakay ang konsepto ng sympathy, compassion, grief, and consolation sa mga hayop. At ang ikatlo ay ang justice cluster kung saan binanggit ang napakaraming anecdotes, no, at mga pag-aaral patungkol sa konsepto ng sharing, equity, fair play, and forgiveness na makikita din sa mga hayop. Doon sa unang papel na yon, aking ginamit ang pangalawang punto, ang empatiya. Ito ay aking inuugnay bilang etikong batayan na kawangki ng sa mga Pilipino, ang pandama. Sa aking sa pantaha, higit na umaalam at nagpapahayag ang karaniwang Pinoy ng kanyang damdamin kaysa sa intelektual na pamamaraan. Ginamit ko dito ang lohikang geometriko ni Leonardo Mercado sa aklat na The Filipino Mind. Aking binigyang paliwanag sa pamamagitan ng mga piling halimbawa ng mga kaugaliang Pilipino na ang empatiya ng mga hayop ay kaugaliang Pinoy at ang kaugaliang Pinoy ng pandama ay maaari ring maging etikong batayan ng pagkilala, pangangalaga, at pilosopikong batayan ng ugnayan sa pagitan ng mga tao, hayop, at kalikasan. Ang pagtatangkang ito ay sa konteksto ng lokal na pamimilosopiya sa panahon ngayon na hindi masyadong nasasaling ng mga diskurso sa etika dito sa atin at sa pilosopiyang Pilipino. Now, dumako tayo dito sa aking proyekto sa ngayon. Ang pangalawa at kasalukuyang proyekto ay tumatahak sa kabilang direksyon. Kung ang una ay mula sa epistemolohiya ng mga hayop patungo sa etikong pagtalakay, sa saliksik na ito ay mula sa etiko ng mga hayop patungo sa epistemeng pagninilay. So, binaliktad ko lang, no? Bakit nga ba pagninilay ang napiling kaparaanan sa pagsisiyasat na ito? Una, lubhang malawak ang sakop kung uusisaing mabuti ang usapin patungkol sa karapatan ng mga hayop. Nauna na riyan ang bulto ng siyentipikong paliwanag mula pa kay Charles Darwin hanggang kay B.F. Skinner at iba pa. Ang mga relihiyoso at spiritual na pananaw sa aklat ng Genesis ni Rod Priest at David Fraser at ang mga antropolohiyang paliwanag ng mga eksperto sa araling panlipunan tulad ni Prospero Cobar, Salcita at iba pa. At ang panghuli at lalong higit, ang pilosopikong pagsisiyasan. Nais kong sumentro sa panghuling nabanggit, partikular na ang etika at epistemolohiya. Ngunit hayaan ninyo akong magtapat sa kadahilan ng hanggang sa ngayon ay wala pa rin akong konkretong linaw. No? Wala pang konkretong linaw ang bunga ng direksyong ito. Kung kaya't higit na minabuti ko na pagnilayan muna sa ngayon ang interes na ito habang bubot at bumunti pa lamang ang mga datos na aking natipon. Kaya itong presentasyon na ito ay napakaikli lang sapagkat kakailanganin ko ang inyong mga expertise. No? Gayunpaman, ang proyektong ito ay nagnanais na makadagdag sa kasalukuyang mga akda patungkol sa environmental ethics, ethology, at maging sa ethics of the non-human na bihirang masaling ng malaliman sa pagtuturo natin ng etika sa bansa. Minsan panghuli pa ito, no? Minsan sa special question pa lumalabas ito, no? O minsan sa graduate school pa natin naririnig ang mga ito. Yan. Ito ay maaari ring makaambag. Proyektong ito ay maaari ding makaambag sa lupon ng mga classroom resources sa ethics, epistemology, Filipino philosophy at mga kaugnay na disiplina. Kung ang etika ay ang sangay ng filosofiya na nakatutok sa pagtukoy at pagsusuri ng moralidad ng paggawa, ang epistemolohiya naman ay ang filosopikong pag-aaral sa natura ng pag-iisip. Malaking usapin sa animal cognition ang debate ng kamalayan o ang consciousness. Ang kaisipan ay itinuturo mula pa noong una na tangi lamang sa atin. Hinati ni Aristoteles sa dalawang bahagi ang kaluluwa ng mga hayop. Ayon sa kanyang sulating On the Soul, ang isa ay gumaganap bilang tagapagtaguyod ng material na bagay, material na buhay. Halimbawa ng mga ito ay ang bahagi na mayroong kinalaman sa sustansya, metabolismo at reproduktibong pangailangan upang maipagpatuloy ang buhay. Ang ikalawa ay ang pandama, kung saan ito ay may pangkalahatang uri na naghahati sa mundo ng halaman at mga hayop. Ito yung ating tinuturong genus. Idinagdag niya bilang ikatlong uri ang espesipikong pagkakaiba na natatangi sa tao bilang buhay na nag-iisip. Ito na yung ating rational soul. At ito ay tangi lamang sa tao. Noong panahon ng moderno ay muling binuhay ni Rene Descartes ang argumento ni Platon na ang kawalan ng kakayanan sa lengguwahe ay kawalan ng katwiran ng isang nilikha o nilalang. Sa kanyang liham, tinukoy ni Descartes na ang hayop ay isang uri ng automaton o isang komplikadong makina. Ang makinang ito ay may kakayahang pagalawin ang sarili at may masalimuot na bahagi. Bagaman isang makina pa rin maituturing. Ayon dito, kung ang mga hayop ay makina, wala itong kakayahang makipag-ugnay, masaktan, magalit at magtampo sapagkat sila ay wala namang isip. Sa halip ay binubuo lamang sila ng pisikal na katawan na dinidiktahan ng natura o instinct. Si Aristoteles, Descartes, ng ilan pang mga pilosopo tulad nila Santo Tomas ng Aquino, sila David Hume, Immanuel Kant at iba pa, ididetalye ko yan dun sa final paper, ay may magkakahalintulad na pagtukoy sa mga hayop bilang mga buhay na entitiya, ngunit walang kakayanang pangkamalayan. At dahil dito sila ay bahagi ng kalikasan na maaaring gamitin ng tao sa paraang nais nito. So dito ako nanggagaling at aking inilalatag sa inyo ang mga katanungan sa saliksik na ito. Una, anong etika maaaring magmula sa pag-aaral natin ng buhay ng mga hayop? At kung ito ay matukoy man, hindi ba't ito ay pagpapatuloy lamang ng anthropomorphismong pagtanaw sa kapaligiran sa perspektibo ng mga tao? Paano harapin nga ba ang ganitong argumento? Aking pangalawang katanungan ay ano-ano ang mahalagang usapin sa pagkilala, sa pag-aruga, pagtatanggol sa karapatan ng isang kahayupan? Kung papaanong ang etikong batayan na ito ay maaaring maging paraan ng pagtanto as a tool of epistemological uh, uh, pag-alam, no? Hinati ko ito sa tatlo, no? Ang etika ng kahayupan, ang epistemolohiya ng kahayupan, at yung aking reflection. Sa unang papel ay ito ang nauna, epistemolohiya ng kahayupan, and then etika ng kahayupan ang pangalawa bilang aking conclusion. Sa ngayon, ito ang aking mga nakita at aking kasalukuyan pa rin tinitingnan ang mga sulatin nila. At marami na rin dito ay na-discuss dun sa aking unang papel, no, yung part 1. This is the part 2. Yan. So kung meron kayong nakikita na karapat-dapat isama, I'm more than willing, no, to adhere to your advices. So dito, kagaya ng binanggit nila Pierce at dun sa libro nila na Why Justice, ito yung kalipunan ng mga argumento na kung saan pinapakita na indeed they have moral, may tawag doon, nakalimutan ko na, pasensya na, parang moral, something to do with wild morality, no? Pasensya na kayo, nakalimutan ko. Ang ikalawang bahagi, yan, ito yung mga aking natipo, no? Sa ikalawang bahagi ay ang argumento na nagpapatunay na indeed meron silang kaalaman, no? At ito yung diskurso, meron diyan mga sumulat na wala, meron diyang sumulat na meron na indeed meron, no, kakanyahan ang mga hayop patungkol sa pag-alam. Aking na banggit na dun sa unang papel na meron silang kakayahan, no, umalam, ngunit ito ay hindi sa paraang ating nakagisnan, yung ating nakasanayan. Meron at meron sila. Subalit kung ating ipapataw kung ano yung ating nalalaman, yung ating nakagisnan, lubhang masasabing wala nga silang kaalaman o kakayahang umalam. So doon, no, yung sa first paper, I tried to open and call the attention of everybody kasi masyado tayong tutok, no, sa angkin, no, talino ng mga tao at hindi masyadong nabigyang pansin, no, ang mga hayop ay meron din kakayanan, hindi lang sa pangkaraniwang inaasahan. At magugulat kayo, ito ay mas maano pa, no, mas higit pa doon sa ating mga kakayanan. Yan. Ang ikatlo, ito na yung aking pagninilay na kung saan gusto kong sumentro ang argumento sa karanasan o obserbasyon ng tuwa, ligaya, sakit at paghihirap na sa aking palagay ay meron, no, at nararanasan din ng mga hayop. Another puntos dito ay yung tungkulin ng mga tao sa hayop at sa mga non-human animals, no? Maging ang etikong basihan ng pagkilala sa karapatan ng lahat ng meron, may buhay man o wala. Gusto kong mag-end. Definitely itong mga ito ay pansamantala lamang, pero gusto kong mag-end dun sa notion ng pag-ibig na meron, no, naniniwala yung karamihan doon sa aking mga nabasa so far at nais kong isulong ito. Ang nagbibigkis sa lahat ng katalinuhan at ng etiko ay sa pagmamahal, pag-ibig, no? Sana magkaroon ng bunga yung aking tatahakin na ito. Ngayon wala pang conclusion, no? Wala pang conclusive, wala pang permanent or fixed na resulta nito. Pero nais kong susugan, no, i-argue na yung pag-ibig ay nagaganap at meron, no, sa mga hayop. At doon masasabing yung kanilang etiko at epistemolohiya ay posibleng maganap. Yan. I don't know if I make sense, but I try to make this thing simple pagdating sa paper. Yan. At panghuli, nilagay ko din dyan yung buhay ng mga non-humans. No? Kasi ang pananaw natin sa ngayon ay tayo lamang, pero hindi din natin masyado na nakukonsidera sa ating mga pag-iisip, pagpaplano ang susunod na henerasyon. Kumbaga sa business, okay, kumikita tayo ngayon, pero pag naubos ang resources na to, ay wala na akong pakialam kasi kumita naman ako sa panahon ngayon. Gusto kong ilapat yung ganong konsepto, no, yung balangkas na yon sa mga hayop naman. Maaring ngayon nag-i-enjoy tayo sa pagkonsumo ng mga non-human animals, no, pero hindi natin alam ang mga susunod pagdating ng mga susunod na henerasyon. Itong mga konsepto na ito ay nakita ko din no, dito nga sa mga naisulat ko dito ng mga sources at kasalukuyan ko pa rin again binibisita ang mga ito at aking sinusuri. So dito ako magtatapos at I welcome suggestions kung meron po kayong suggestions and clarifications and questions. Salamat po.
Time to facilitate. So for 10 minutes, the table is open. But again, first, congratulations, Dr. Rhochie. No, I'm really, I find your study fascinating. And when it's about animals, you know, I'm a dog lover myself, and so I will always remember. And for that reason, I hate that philosopher by the name of Malebranche. I remember that during my ecclesiastical days, there was this anecdote told to us that just to prove that the dog is just an automaton, you know, no feelings and what. He actually kicked the dog, and the dog is in fact pregnant. So just to imagine it right now really is makes me squirm, no? But that's it. So. And I remember also that, but I do not know the relation at all. But I think there are a lot of novels or even stories where animals are used by authors to represent, I guess, human beings. But maybe it's also a recognition of, you know, of the value of animals, and also point to the fact that they have some feelings that we should recognize. I really do not know, and I'm not so sure, but for example, when I was in high school, I read this book by George Orwell, Animal Farm, where the characters are all animals, but maybe it's a representation of a utopian, an unsuccessful utopia. But anyway, so just for my comment, and so I think I'm quite excited by this study. So may I therefore request, or I'm now opening the table for discussion, for comments, questions, suggestions.
Tanong po ako, Sir Rene.
Yes, sir. You're recognized. Is that Sir Jovi?
Sir Jovi po.
Opo.
Okay.
Jovi po.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Sir Rene. Maano lang, maiksing tanong. Although sabi mo nga, hindi pa naman tapos yung papel. No? Pero yung bang papel ay papatunayan ba nito bandang huli na yung mga hayop ay may kakayanang maging tapos kung sakaling oo ang sagot, papatunayan din ba ng papel na yung kulturang ethical na to ng mga hayop ay pwedeng maging batayan ng isang makataong etika?
Sir Jovi,
yung tanong.
Medyo naputol lang. Naano ko yung the rest. May isang word ka lang na na-miss kanina eh. Naputol yung connection eh. Papatunayan ba ng papel na ito sa dulo na yun nawala yung susunod?
Kung sakaling nga nabalak ng papel na patunayan na yung mga hayop ay may kakayanang maging ethical.
Okay.
Susunod ba rito ay yung layunin na gamitin yung makahayop na etikang ito bilang batayan ng isang makataong etika. Sana malinaw yung tanong.
Oo, kung ang dun sa aking naunang ano na din no, yung part 2 na ito actually doon no nailatag ko kung tama yung aking paliwanag. Nailatag ko doon na indeed they have no ethical, what you call it, gestures or ethical experiences, and the ethics is by our context no, sa konteksto ng mga tao. Yan. Isa sa mga recommendations ko doon, isa sa mga conclusion doon ay no ay pagtanaw nga dito sa mga ethical na ano ba yung manifestation? Itong mga ethical manifestations ng mga tao bilang no, tayong mga tao ay makakuha din no at matuto dito sa kanilang behavior na ito no o gesture na ito. Halimbawa, may mga binanggit na yung kinokuryente yung daga. Doon ako natuwa sa isang kwento na pag kinokuryente yung daga, hindi kakain yung grupo, may isang nakakuryente. So pag kinain ko yun, makukuryente yung daga. So napansin nila doon with the series of experiments, dumating yung punto na ayaw na nilang kumain kasi nga nakukuryente yung isa. Ayan, no? Balikan ko yung sinabi ni Sir Rene no na maari no itong mga literature, movies o kung ano man ay tumutukoy sa mga hayop. Mahayop ito na umaakto sa mga pop culture no, mga movies ay may aral. Kaya palagi ko, sir, I think oo no may aral na makukuha tayo dito provided no na ito nga pagbabasihan natin, isa siya sa mga recommendation or conclusion sa palagay ko nitong continuation ng paper. Yun po.
Salamat, Sir Rhochie. Okay, thank you, Sir Jovi. There is a question here from Jillian Marian Garcia. And the question goes this way, and there's also a comment. It seems that when us humans exercise empathy, we are more in tune with our animalistic side than our rational one. And your research po would prove this, that empathy is primitive. So far po, how does empathy play a role in animal intelligence?
Maganda yung tanong no. Ito yung crux. Ito yung nais ko nabanggit ni ano yan no. Properly articulated. Sino ba ang nagtanong? Si
Jillian Marian.
Ma'am Jillian. Opo. Oo, yan yung gusto ko actually na lumabas sa papel no. As to my limited sources and exploration as of the moment, yung empathy, in-identify ko ito as yung etiko ng kahayupan no. At ito ay merong malaking gampanin patungo sa epistemolohiya ng mga hayop. So kaya nga nabaligtad ko yung ito tama no, this time I proceed from ethics going to epistemology. Yan. So how does empathy play a role? Yan no. Hindi pa ako tapos pero merong mga ilan na hindi ko matanda yung mga konkreto no, pero may mga argumento at yun din ang gusto kong isulong no, personal. In fact, you call me yung presumptuous kasi iniugnay ko ito sa Pilipino na kung saan tayo ay mas naghahayag ng ating saloobin sa pamamagitan ng empatiya, na pamamagitan ng pandama. Hindi tayo nag-uusap pero nauunawaan kita, nararanasan at nararamdaman kita. Yan, no? At ganun din naman ang mga hayop. Definitely wala silang lengguwahe kagaya ng kasopistikado ng sa atin, at marami na nga pilosopo ang tumira, no, at nag-criticize na wala talaga silang intelligence simply because they don't have the means to communicate. Yan. Pero sa akin, aking palagay, kung mamarapatin, itong kanilang pamamaraan ng empathiya ay pamamaraan din ng kanilang pag-alam. Paraan din kung paano nila tumanaw sa kanilang kapaligiran. Paano sila mag-react, no? Either fight or flight. The idea is they empathize yung kanilang nasa paligid. And in doing so, nalalaman nila ang kapaligiran nila, no? Kaya nga ang kanilang kakayahang pagtanto ay nakabase, palagay ko, dito. Hindi man nakabase, pero isa sa mga basihan kung paano nila naaalaman ang kanilang kapaligiran is simply because they empathize. Kaya doon ko palagay ko, no, kung tama ako, nililink ko yung ethics, no, and the conclusion is that of something epistemological. By way of empathy, no, and animals are able to explore and know and interpret what is surrounding them. Kaya nga nabanggit ko, no, sa alam nung asong, ano ba tawag doon? Aspin. Alam nung aspin, asong Pinoy, kung ang tao ay malupit or yung tao ay animal lover. They have that notion. So they empathize, at the same time they are capable of knowing. Yun. I don't want to go further, maubos yung oras, but more or less, yeah. Thank you for articulating, Ma'am Jillian.
I cannot agree more with the last statement of Dr. Rhochie. I think, for example, dogs are very, very sensitive. Anyway, there is a suggestion here from Sir Kevin Hera, and he suggested that, Sir, you may also want to consider Martha Nussbaum's approach to animal ethics in relation to the capabilities approach. More generally, species-specific ethics, yung perspective na ginagamit niya. And since the capabilities of human animals are different from non-human animals, magkaiba rin yung ethical perspective na mag-a-apply for each species. Animal ethics is one of the sub-disciplines na ine-explore ng capabilities approach after dealing with ethics/justice in the sphere of human affairs. He also gave here, thanks to Nera, a link for you to be able to, I guess, look into this this work of Nussbaum.
Salamat, Sir Cross. Thank you very much, Sir Cross. I will, kasi nabanggit dun sa aking mga na-compile collection, na-collecta ko na, lumalabas kay Martha. I have to be honest, I'm not familiar, but lumalabas yung kay Nussbaum na mga puntos nga. And thank you very much, no, at least you have even put here the link. Salamat po. Salamat, Sir Cross.
Okay, the 10 minutes has lapsed, so
I'm sorry.
I guess we have to, I'm not so sure, Sir Franz, whether we have to be strict about these 10 minutes. Maybe there's another, maybe we can entertain one more question if there is one.
Hello, ako, Sir Rene.
Yes, Sir Paulo.
Hello, good evening. Thank you. Hello, Rhochie.
Good evening po.
Unang-una, natutuwa ako dun sa iyong proyekto. Kasi sa tingin ko, isa ito sa mga original na proyekto na ipresenta so far, no? Original in the sense that hindi masyadong napag-uusapan yung animal rights sa philosophy. In general, in philosophy circles in the Philippines, hindi masyado napag-uusapan yung animal rights. So sa tingin ko magandang simulain ito. Naaalala ko lang nung kolehiyo pa tayo. Nakalimutan ko na yung title nung textbook, pero it was on thomistic ethics. And one of the things there mentioned was that animals do not have rights because they are not rational. I don't know, you might be familiar with that textbook, and you might be able to remember the title. Nakalimutan ko na.
Opo.
Siguro subconsciously kinalimutan ko because the argument didn't sit well with me. Just because in your presentation you mentioned that animals don't have the capability to use language. Parang ganun din eh. Language understood as rationality. And because animals are not rational, therefore they don't have the same rights as we do as human beings. And like I said, that didn't sit well with me because I thought back then that if we human beings are rational, it's the same rationality, therefore that causes oppression among animals. So, and I still believe that our overemphasis on human rationality is the reason why we keep on oppressing not only animals but other human beings as well.
Yeah.
And the environment in general, right?
Races.
Natuwa rin ako. I'm interested in the last thing that you mentioned in your presentation, which is love. I'm not sure yet if you're arguing that instead of rationality, it's love that we should pay attention to. Pero hindi ko alam at this point. I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with you because it's something that I think you need to further develop.
Yes, sir.
By way of suggestion, you might want to look into the idea of Gilles Deleuze, of becoming animal, because sa kanyang and maybe Raniel later on could talk more about this sa kanyang 1,000 Plateaus. Doon niya together with Felix Guattari, they talked about the possibility of becoming other, not literally becoming woman or becoming animal, but that gives us yung para bang, I don't know how to phrase it. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it gives us an opportunity to look at things from the perspective of another. That we cannot become like an animal. So becoming animal, I guess, is in a way an epistemological, not necessarily phenomenological, right? But epistemological way of, to put it in simple terms, epistemological way of understanding the point of view of another. Although, of course, the next question is do we become? I mean, the question whether we could actually assume the perspective of another. Is it possible, or are we simply just imposing our own perspective on the other? So that's another question. But I think that nevertheless, it opens up the possibility of welcoming another species. Parang ganon. Nabasa ko yung pangalan ni Peter Singer. Of course, Peter Singer is one of those philosophers, even back in the 70s, who started this revolution on animal ethics. Ang suggestion na baka pwede mong tignan yan together with Martha Nussbaum, of course. Yung parang just further contextualize your study. But I mean, he's still Singer is still working within the idea of rationality. Parang he's arguing, and I don't know if I agree with him that animals are rational or have the same rationality as human beings, and therefore they have the same rights. Parang ganun yung kanyang argument. I might be wrong, but parang initially ganun ko naintindihan. In relation to that, natutuwa ako na sinabi ni Jovi kanina na pagka sinubukan nating intindihin yung pagka how did he phrase it, yung nakalimutan paano ba phrase si Jovi kanina, yung magiging mas tao tayo,
take it from them,
mas kung magiging mas high, parang pagkakaintindi ko, kung susubukan nating maging hayop, mas magiging makatao tayo. Parang gano'n. Parang siguro gano'n din. Gano'n din yung sinasabi ni Deleuze.
Parang may pinapatungkulan si Rhochie sa UST-GS.
I intentionally, Sir Jovi, intentionally make it a kind of fun yung ang etiko ng kahayupan. Kasi yung hayop has been degraded, the idea na when we say hayop ka, it's the same as berating, no? Masama ka, bastos ka, and so on. Baka may makita tayo sa kanila na
hindi lagi si Rhochie, may mga expression din na hayop sa ganda.
Yeah.
Galing.
Text,
lastly na lang, Rhochie, kung yung idea ng love or pagmamahal, ang tanong ko lang, this is a very a playful question. Maituturing ba nating mga hayop ang mga virus?
Yeah.
At posible ba nating mahalin ang virus? At papaano yun? Kasi of course they are also a specific species, if you want. They are living. They're basically living beings. If animals like dogs and cats, arguably, are not capable of human language, viruses, bacteria, and so on are not capable of things that cats and dogs are capable of. So, anong klaseng how do I phrase it? What kind of hospitality, for lack of a better word, what kind of hospitality?
How can we welcome a virus?
Because if it's possible to become an animal, is it also possible to become a virus? Understanding the virus from its point of view. And in the context of your paper, what kind of ethics then or epistemology can, let's say, coronavirus offer us? Okay, doon na lang muna. Thank you.
Sige po, sir. I'm taking these things. Thank you po.
Okay. So thank you so much for those who gave their reactions and suggestions and questions. So that's the end of the segment. So I will now start with my presentation. Is that it, Dr. Franz?
Yes, Sir Rene.
Okay, so thank you so much. I hope this will be quick. So I will share my screen now.
Yes.
All right. Okay. First, let me good evening to everyone, and please, I just like to inform you that actually this is not research really in philosophy, but more on how we do research. So it's titled "Researching the Researchers for the 21st Century: Needs, Challenges, and Productivity." Let me just say that actually this This particular research was a product of a conversation with one of the directors of CHED at the time, when he talked about research and researchers, and they are planning to come up with policies for researchers to help the researchers. So the thing that I asked him was, but have you ever identified the needs of the researchers and the difficulties that they are experiencing? And so he told me, oh, why not come up with such a research? So that's the start of this research, and so we applied this to the grants in aid program of CHED, and we were able to get 2.8 million pesos. Initially, the proponents of this particular project was me as the principal investigator, Dr. De Castro, as well as Les Paul Valdez, and another person from, as well as Professor Dorothy Lay Labrador, my classmate in educational psychology in LaSalle. And then when it was approved, later there's another person who's part of our group that wouldn't be able to make it anymore, and so I invited Dr. Alan de Guzman also to join, and also later that upon the suggestion of CHED, we also included Professor Fredericusto Guido David of UP Diliman. Professor Guido David is actually a mathematician, and I think he's the one that who's very prominent now because of this COVID-19 modeling that he does here creates mathematical model for the COVID-19 as to the spread of the virus, and so that's what he's doing right now. So our subject of research would be the researchers, both from of course, the social sciences, the human sciences, and of course, the natural sciences. And we know this very well that, there's always a problem with research productivity of our researchers. And to a certain extent, it's always their productivity is actually affected by individual issues, institutional issues, and leadership issues, which I guess most of us are quite familiar with, even here in UST. This is something of a good news. Philippines ranks 50th among the 131 economies in the Global Innovation Index. So when you say Global Innovation Index, one of the parameters here is of course, on technology, on patents, and of course, on research, as well as, of course, education and political situation. I think what is good though is that in 2020, among 131 countries, we ranked number 50, which is actually a kind of improvement from 2014 to 2020. And I think one of the reasons, although sometimes we don't feel it in the humanities, but there appears to be a lot of money that was poured into reach and to research and technology developments. And of course, we have this program of Balik Scientists to help our researchers, or even our scientists here in the Philippines, and to help our schools to be more innovative and more connected with industries. And so the objective of our study is just to study the Filipino faculty researchers. We'd like to look into their research productivity in the context of their needs, challenges, and of course, for the purpose of, possible solutions in terms of policy recommendations to CHED or even to institution, also of course appropriate interventions. But of course, I always have this labor advocacy. So my hope is somehow that the result of the study would also help in improving the working conditions of researchers, and also to give them more respect, and also more opportunities for them to be able to do their work, and for society, really, the Philippines, even our leaders, to really value research as a very, very important factor for us to be able to develop as a country. So there is already a framework, and we are using the PPA Research Development Framework. So It focuses on 4 items: knowledge and intellectual abilities, personal effectiveness, research engagement, influence and impact of the researchers, and research governance and organization. So when we talk about knowledge and intellectual abilities, well, it refers to knowledge and abilities necessary to carry out excellent research in terms of cognitive abilities and creativity. So what are the questions that we ask our researchers? What are the knowledge and skills that you consider important for one to be successful in research? Number 2, what cognitive abilities one must possess for him to be able to do and succeed in research? Sometimes there are variations in the answers because I think also of the discipline, no? But to a certain extent also, there are some answers that, or many answers that are quite general or universal in nature. And when we talk about personal effectiveness, so these are personal qualities, no? Like do they take terms of self-management, how motivated they are, how do they make sure that they develop as a researcher, no? So questions like what motivates you in doing research, and of course we ask them to tell us about their problems in doing how research, and how do they deal with the challenges. And then of course research governance and organization. In other words, there are certain professional conduct expected of researchers, like following, of course, the ethics of research, part of which also is I'm quite amazed that when I talk to researchers, there's even such a thing called gift authorship. Just because you know, he will supply the materials that will be used or that will be examined in the research. He would ask the primary researcher if he can be part of the authorship. There are things like that. Or there are also a lot of free riders in research, you know, in the publication. So if you have, for example, 8 authors, doesn't follow necessarily that all of them really contributed to the research. But of course, there are supposed to be rules as to how authorship are supposed to be identified. No, there are criteria, but again, nonetheless, it doesn't follow necessarily that you know, that these are really observed. That's the reality of it all. Then, of course, engagement, influence, and impact. So the question that we ask is, could you describe how your work with others in connection with your research? Could you tell us how to communicate and disseminate your research? And of course, also the impact of one's research. Now, who are the respondents here? So we have actually, it's both quantitative and qualitative. So we prepared and we validated a questionnaire, which is rather long. And so I guess to a certain extent, it's a kind of, it discourages people or even researchers to answer, because I think it's around 70 questions. I understand, and I thank also the members of this department. Some of them I know answered, despite the length, answered the questions. No? And of course, they are from Percy's and Burnett schools. These are schools that are, in a way, already have some kind of research departments in the institution, and these are actually identified by CHED. And of course, there is also a research classification. By the way, the classification is sourced from CHED CMO 52 Series 2016. So researchers can be classified into 4. 1 to first stage researcher, early career researcher, established researchers, and leading researchers. And there is also a corresponding description. So when you talk about first stage researcher, these are doctoral candidates who conduct research under the supervision of a principal investigator, as they express intent to develop knowledge of research methodologies and discipline. And then an early career researcher would be a doctorate degree holder, but have not yet established a significant level of independence, experience, and competence. He is at the beginning of their research careers. It's normally 10 years, no? exhibits all competences of first stage researchers. And then established researchers, these are exhibits all necessary and most desirable competences of early career researchers, has already established some kind of reputation, and he conducts research independently, which advances a research agenda, can take the lead in executing collaborative research projects, cooperation, publishes papers as lead author, organizes workshop or conference sessions, and then establishes collaborative relationships with relevant industry research or development groups. And then, of course, leading researchers. These are researchers that lead a team or a group of researchers. Of course, there are also leading researchers that may actually be just an individual who operate as lone researchers. Okay, but I guess this may be true in most cases in the field of humanities. Exhibits all necessary and most desirable competences of staff researchers, has international reputation based on research excellence in their field, has publications in particularly prestigious journals or by leading publishing houses, possesses work of outstanding originality, recipients of competitive grants as principal investigators, external recognition of research quality, and of course, critical judgment in the identification, execution of research activities. So this would be the definition that we adopt in our research endeavor. So far, implementation of the study, we are done with the designing and planning. We all have also undertaken partial review of related literature. As we do our research, we continue on reading. The ethics approval is also done. We have already pilot tested. In fact, went beyond that. In reality, we are actually right now in the actual data gathering. Of course, data gathering is in the form of online survey. We have that questionnaire. Of course, we also have this physical or the same questionnaire, but on paper. At the same time, of course, that is the I would say the quantitative portion. But also, because it's COVID-19, we are supposed to have actually focus group discussion. But we realize we cannot do that. We cannot just travel from one region to the other and interview researchers. So what we did as a kind of adjustment is to come up with this 2020 colloquy series, where we invited some keynote speakers. Their names are here. I suppose this guy is familiar to you. He's from Clarivate, of course, Dr. Alan de Guzman. I suppose you have also heard Dr. Cristina Guevara, who happens to be the one in charge of research in DOST. And I was surprised that he's also a very, very good classical piano player. And of course, Eva Maria Puchonko. So our design is such that when we have these speakers, we will be able to also to attract researchers, because for them to improve and also to know how can they improve as researchers. And at the same time, maybe for example, we are done with Dr. Seng and Dr. De Guzman this coming Saturday, and all of you are invited. We have Rowena Guevara, and she will speak on funding. And so I guess a lot of researchers attend also for this reason. And then so we are now in our last 2 Saturdays, and so but what's important here? This is where we want to generate some kind of conversation. So we invited, for example, in the first session, we invited the beginning researchers based on the definition that I have presented earlier. And one came is from Ateneo, but he's at this time is studying his doctorate in Yale. So these are some of the people. No, again, let me. Okay, these are the first batch. Mga beginning researchers yan. Hindi kasama si Darilag dahil siya ano lang yung opening remarks. I don't know why his picture was included here. He just actually gave the opening remarks. But we have Mr. Trinidad studying in Yale University at this University of Chicago rather at this time. Ruel Bennett is also our professor, but at the same time he is into I think mycology, and I think he's a doctoral candidate also in Frankfurt, if I'm not mistaken, or Goethe University. Of course, Parial is a co-professor of mine or co-instructor of mine in the College of Nursing, and right now he is actually taking up his doctorate in Hong Kong Polytechnic. And then this one is from Santo Tomas, Mr. Marvin of Mielka. And I'm so happy that through the recommendation also of our department chair, Dr. Jovi, that Christine Abigail Tan also was part of the discussant. And she really shared a lot of wonderful things about research, especially in the field of humanities. Here, what we are trying to do is we try to make sure that all the disciplines are also are represented in the discussions, no, as discussants. So we have one from the sciences, we have also from the social sciences, and of course in the humanities. So that's how we do it. And again, there's also an open forum, but we require them also to submit some. Well, we record it and we ask their permission so that from their manifestation or from their sharing, we can come up. We can create a paper out of this. So this is the second session last Saturday. Of course, it was Dr. Patrick Macabeo. I learned that he's also from student. I mean, he's from also took his doctorate in Germany. Melbourne Talaktak is from Korea, but he's from Cavite State University. But he took his doctorate in I think in the Korean University. But I think what is also interesting, for example, this lady is of course from Ateneo de Manila, and imagine she was given $50 million grant because I think her study is on energy. And then of course Jonah Labor from UP, this time related to communication, media studies. But I guess so hanggang dito pa lang kami. But what I feel is quite remarkable, and I'm quite happy, is that somehow the sharing of the first group is in a way different from the sharing of the second group. So that's where also I realized that really when you are a first stage researcher, your needs are different. The challenges could also be different from, let's say, a higher level type of researchers, as in the case of the second group. So I would expect that in the next this coming Saturday, again, there will be a different highlights or a different stress in some of the needs and challenges of researchers, because this time will be in we are already inviting established researchers. I'm happy to note, for example, that we were able to invite Destura, Dr. Destura, the one that pioneered the COVID-19 I think test here in the Philippines that is local, and also other Dr. Montoya. So I would say that so far we are quite lucky that we were able to at least to get the best researchers that we have. At least they have the reputation. Of course, there are more, but it's just that it's a pity that we cannot because we are limited in terms of time, and so we cannot get more researchers. Also, these are I think the participant in the first webinar last 2 Saturdays ago, and there are around 100 higher educational institutions that send their representatives. Okay, and so what is our target publication? At least hopefully we promised that we'll be able to come up with 4 publications. Current research skills of researchers, Second publication would be an assessment of research productivity in the Philippines. Third is assessment of research in both soft and hard sciences, mentor-mentee gap analysis, and then research challenges in the context of CHED's typologies of researchers. Some of this would be in a quantitative approach, the others would be qualitative or at the same time mixed. But as I listen, maybe there could be more papers that could be developed out of the sharing of the researchers. Okay, but what challenges are we encountering or we have encountered? The issue of funding disbursement. You know what? This is the 2.8 million research grant. But my problem is UST has not yet received the 2.8 million, and this is not the problem of CHED. The problem lies in UST because there is a requirement that before an amount will be downloaded to UST, all the other research that are required to liquidate must have already liquidated. But sad to say, we have been waiting for more than a year that up to now, the liquidation reports of some of this research have not been completed. So it's in that sense that we are in a way in suspended animation. But I feel personally that it cannot be done. We have to do something about it. So what I do is, of course, we cut the staff. We have only one staff right now. But at the same time, you know, I and Dr. De Castro have no choice but to draw first from our own money and to be able to pay for our staff because hindi naman pwede hindi siya babayaran to gather all this data and to do all this coordination. So that is what we have been doing for more than a year. So it's quite difficult as well. Of course, the retrieval of data sometimes it's really very, very difficult. You give them all the questionnaire, but it doesn't follow that it will come back to you. And of course, we also encountered this data privacy concerns because at that time, that was the time I think that the data privacy law was given an IRR, and of course, people were still reacting and they don't know what to do. So essentially, those are the challenges. So that's about all. This is what my sharing is all about. Again, I hope you don't mind that this is not really philosophical, but this is where I found myself. Okay, you know. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sir Tadle, for your presentation. Now the floor is open for your questions or clarifications. I think we have 10 minutes for the exchange.
Raniel, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Sir Pao. Proceed po.
Okay. Hello, Sir Rene. Good evening.
Yes, good evening, sir.
Thank you for your sharing. I'll try to be brief, no, kasi my wife is calling me for dinner. Yung una, yung mga siguro I'll just mention those that that I noticed, no. Of course, yung unang napansin ko the spokesperson that you mentioned, for example, one from Clarivate, and then one academic from UST who talk about publications.
Mm-hmm.
My worry is how do I put this? My worry is if we of course there's no problem inviting one from Clarivate. As a matter of fact, I know the person. I know the spokesperson personally. Kaya lang kasi my problem with that is that aren't we parang repeating or proliferating the same narrative that publication should always be when you publish, you should always consider bibliometrics and always consider the impact factor of journals where you're going to publish your work. And of course, that's what someone from Clarivate will always say.
Right.
Paulit-ulit lang. And then of course, we have one, so to speak, quote unquote, a top researcher from UST who uh, uh, is known to have I call this known to have generated this many citations and publications, churning out publications every year. Uh, kaya lang it's the same narrative. It's the same narrative that we get. The thing is, if we are going to try to inspire people to publish, especially the younger ones or those who are just starting. I'm not too sure if I'm not too sure, at least based from my experience. I'm not too sure if it's very effective to inspire them by uh, parang at the very beginning we tell them that publication is all about it's all about the metrics. It's all about bibliometrics, especially in the humanities. So yun yung aking worry. I don't know if in the future you would consider uh, inviting people who I suppose would not how do I put this, would not put forward the status quo argument, if that makes sense. Yung parang maybe maybe we could inspire more people to publish and to actually go actually do research if we um yung para bang uh, you do research not because the university is playing the metrics game,
Mm.
parang ganon. And then of course I appreciate that you invited Christine Christine Tan to be one of your speakers. Pero napansin ko rin na mag-isa rin lang niya from the humanities. And I noticed a lot of people from the sciences, the social sciences. Maganda rin siguro if we in the future invite and listen to, more importantly, listen to the stories of people from literature, from history, uh, of course, from philosophy. Uh, may perhaps because through these minor narratives, in other words, we would be able to perhaps get an alternative story about research, um, as opposed to you know un- uh, it would be unfortunate kasi later on if the same narrative is repeated. Uh, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just a suggestion. And of course, the gesture of researching the researchers and trying to understand the challenges um, is profoundly appreciated. But I think meron din yung mga from the fringes, no, from the maybe like I said, we could listen more to people from disciplines that are considered minor at this point. For example, disciplines that don't require, for instance, funding as a requirement to be considered a top researcher. Parang ganon.
Ah,
Kasi laging nandun yun eh. In one of the yung pinadala yung tier yung three research tiers na ginawa ng OVRI, for example, laging nakalagay doon that uh, you're a top researcher if you're able to attract funding. Pero para sa akin, I don't think it's necessary that funding is a requirement in order for one to be a top researcher or a researcher that is well sought after by colleagues or by by the international community. Parang ganun. In other words, I'm not sure if, apart from, of course, for example, if we try to look into the works of the philosophers, I don't think someone like Heidegger actually required to or applied for funding in order for him to write Being in Time or his other works. Parang ganun lang. Yung is there an alternative way of looking at research in contrast to the current and more popular narrative that research is for metrics. It is tied to the ranking of the university and so on and so forth. Baka may alternative na story out there that needs to be listened to, parang ganun. So thank you, Sir Rene.
Let me just make my comment. I also agree and I share your concerns. I think essentially, one of the problems would be how, for example, research in the humanities will be treated. But at the same time, let me also say that we made it a point that, by the way, it's just being pragmatic on our part. We have actually invited keynote speakers, one from Clarity, of course, Dr. Alan de Guzman, the one from DOST, and also the last one in the field of medicine. Okay, to talk about the last one, we talk about book research programs. But these are to enable us to draw the researchers so that they can, number one is for them to be able to, because we are not happy yet with our respondents. We're only able to get 270, although quantitatively that's okay, but we want to get some more. And so we decided we cannot move around the country. We are supposed to have focus group discussions, and so we have no choice but to bring them here. And to bring them here to attend in this webinar, we have to have some topics like the how to publish, things like those, no, funding, etc. These metrics. So these are really the narratives. It's something that I have to recognize. But in our research itself, no, we really will not touch their stories. We are going to focus on the stories of the researchers that we requested to be the discussants. So that's what we are interested in. Again, as I have said, we should have moved around the country to talk to these researchers and for us to know their stories. But again, we don't have that luxury right now. So we decided to invite them, and we just have to decided to make sure that at least the broad disciplines that include the humanities are also invited. So that's the context. Again, but I think I would also agree with you that to a certain extent we are limited by the definition, because yes, I'd like to believe that even the way CHED defines the different types of researchers are actually biased towards the dominant narrative. In that sense, I would agree with you. So, but in that sense, therefore, but I'm hoping that somehow in the stories of the researchers, that we assigned as discussants, we will also be hearing some kind of alternative narratives. And to a certain extent, I could see it. But so I still have 2 days to, although to really to look for those narratives. But again, these are concerns that I also share with you, Dr. Pao. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, Sir Tadle. Are there any questions? I think we can only entertain one more question before we proceed to the next session. Or if there's no question, I think Sir Rene, can you perhaps provide your comment on Kevin Nera's comments?
May I know what is the comment?
It's in the ano po, no? So,
Oh, sorry.
do you want me to read it po, sir? Or
Yeah, please do so. Please, because I'm still learning this.
yeah. Okay, sir. According to Kevin the Lover Boy Nera, there's a strong bias against the humanities during the process of formulating the CMOs. 2016 was still in CHED when those were being formulated, as we tried to include the research grants for K-12 in those guidelines. Because of this bias, the team had to fight for separate grants or budget for the humanities, which we were able to secure in partnership with NCCA.
NCAA, right.
So sabi niya, bias ang guidelines kontra humanities kasi malakas ang bias kontra humanities sa CHED mismo.
Yeah, you know what? It's in that sense. That's why I mentioned earlier when I look at the descriptors of, let's say, the different types of researchers. Yeah, I think there's a certain level of bias, really, and that is something that I acknowledge. And I guess that is something that, in a way, would also we have to recognize as a limitation of the study. But again, I'm still hoping that the narratives that will come from the humanities through this study, because I think there's always one discussion for every, there's a humanities discussion for every session. I hope I'll be able to hear more from them, and more especially also, hopefully, that even our questionnaires, there would be issues also along these lines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Sir Rene Tadle.
You're welcome.
So, Sir Franz, can I start na po?
Yes, Dr. Reyes.
So, good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen. So, nakikita niyo na po ba yung file ko?
Yes, sir.
So, magandang gabi po ulit. I'm proud to say that my internet connection is better. Okay, so here's my work in progress paper, and this is perhaps a better version of the one I presented in the last critical theory conference. So this consists of maybe 7 or 8 pages. So again, this is a diversion from my original working title. So the title is Theorizing the Coordinatariats in the Age of Pandemic. So basically, this is a reconstruction of Bippo Berardi's theorization of the coordinatariats in the age of the COVID-19 pandemic. So generally, I seek to perhaps analyze and perhaps expose some of the errors, if not problems, in relation to Berardi's analysis of semi-capitalism against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it consists of 5 parts. The first part is about the pandemic and capitalism. The second deals with the nature of semi-capitalism. The third is about the cognitariats or the elsewhere class. The fourth is entitled Teachers and Students as the New Cognitariats. And the fifth one um, is via a question, what is to be done in this age of spasm? So the first part is not yet well developed, so I hope later through your questions you'd help me. Pandemic and capitalism. Since its origination or origin in Wuhan, China, the COVID-19 pandemic has engendered multifaceted physiological, psychological, economic, and political problems that recognize no cultural boundaries. In various advanced societies such as UK and USA, its populace's accelerated mobility has aggravated the spread of the virus and has strengthened surveillance capitalism in conjunction with other pre-existing societal maladies. Meanwhile, in many Southeast Asian countries, the virus has likewise exposed the fragility and danger of political power because one of the leaders, for example, in the Philippines, is their approach in combating the COVID-19 is through a militarized means. So the next part is about semio-capitalism. So our contemporary world finds its meaningful description in Baudrillard's Civilization of Hyperreality. In this novel reality, models and abstractions are not merely produced without geographic reference. Rather, they are generated in such a way that they precede or engender any sense of territoriality. That they don't. Berardi adheres to this claim and further argues that simulacrum is the nerve center, if not the central element of what he calls semio-capitalism. Berardi conceptualizes semio-capitalism as the regime of production wherein the incessant production of information flows serves as the driving force of capital valorization. This new system subjugates society's nervous system or psychological energy and not only the physical energy of the workers in the factory. In fact, all of us now are workers, are laborers. Moreover, it utilizes the radical potentials of digital revolution or the cyberspace towards its exponential and unremitting evolution. So communicating and learning through computers or any technological device or using any technological devices is one of the inevitable features of the contemporary period. Many of our daily activities and intersubjective relations are mediated, expedited, and operated through machines nowadays, such as online banking, buying, and learning, to name a few. Due to the pandemic, people in different walks of life converted their homes into workplaces because of the relatively safer environment they offer. As dear as it may seem, it has likewise engendered manifold challenges and problems, especially to the marginalized, economically, geographically, psychologically, among others. To be more specific, the rise of digital revolution has greatly transfigured our psyche and mental environment. While it expands our psychocognitive imagination and perception, it also radicalizes our sensibilities as humans. As Berardi notes in Heroes, the fact that human beings learn more vocabulary from a machine than from their mothers is undeniably leading to the development of a new kind of sensibility. In the field of language learning, the young spend their early formative years in constant relationship with technological devices such as mobile phones, tablets, and laptops. And I have to confess that sometimes I'm guilty of this, especially if you are living in a small house. If you really want to do your lectures, your student activities, and you have a baby beside you, it's really inevitable, no, for you from time to time to give him or her them, no, gadgets for them to watch certain videos in YouTube, etc., etc. This info machine experience entails lesser face-to-face bodily contact with other children and people, and this problem has aggravated because of the pandemic. So the more that this experience becomes complex and almost inescapable, children are increasingly removed from the bodily presence of others and are subjected merely to virtual communication with distant entities whose body does not belong to unsensitive and sensible space. Indeed, sensibility, sensitivity, and to be more specific, empathy face the great dangers of dissipating and of being pathologized under the present conditions. This leads Berardi to likewise claim that precarity in today's time is not limited to the condition of the cognitive laborer or cognitive labor, but also to the fragmentation of the social body, the fracturing of self-perception, and of the cellularization of time. The third part is about the cognitarians, this new class. I will skip this part. Of course, in critical theory, there is no single class that will guide emancipation or revolution. So for them, resistance, analysis, emancipation, all of these things are culture bound. Meaning to say, individuals do not need to become laborers in the factory to be exploited and to become agents of social change. Black people, indigenous communities, the LGBT, health practitioners, students, teachers, to name a few. Similarly, oppression is not merely economic, it can be geopolitical, cyber, moral, academic, among others. So let's skip this part. According to Berardi, the financial deterritorialization that occurs in the age of semi-capitalism fashions a post-bourgeois class. This novel kind of class neither occupies a single milieu nor is identified with specific community. It's a class defined by its virtual labor or that gains from virtual activities like net trading, business process outsourcing, and high-tech immaterial production. So precarity is the general condition of semio-cognitive or virtual workers. But I need to accentuate that these workers are only called virtual because of the nature of their activities, because they perform virtual activities. They are not similar, they're not the same with how Deleuze and Guattari define the virtual people, which for them refers to the people to come. Following Berardi, the essential transformation induced by the digitalization of the labor process is the fragmentation of the personal continuity of work, the fractalization and cellularization of time. The worker disappears as a person and is replaced by abstract fragments of time. Meanwhile, in another book, The Soul of Work, he notes that being virtual laborers does not only include the exhaustion of one's cognitive faculty or intellect. More importantly, it affects their concrete existence, that is, their bodies, sexuality, and the unconscious. In fact, he uses the concept soul to refer to the assemblage of all these faculties or planes. The soul is a web, for Berardi, of attachments and tastes, attractions, and inclinations. The soul is not simply the seat of intellectual operations, but the affective and libidinal forces that weave together a world attentiveness, the ability to address, care for, and appeal to others. So the fourth part, teachers and students, the new cognitarians. In this research project, I argue that students and teachers are also victims of Berardi's twofold theorization of precarity. Despite the brain's unlimited productive potentialities, it remains inscribed in the students' and teachers' affective body, the limits of attention, psychic energy, and sensibility, among others. While networks and systems have accelerated the very format and configurations of the semio or infosphere, the receptive capacity of our brains cannot cope up with this form of acceleration or process. In other words, the human brain, which is composed of flesh and fragile organs, are not configured like the systems of digital transmitters. So a myriad of problems is experienced by teachers in this pandemic. Most of them overlap with students as well as with their manifold roles in the family. Some of them are, and allow me to present some of them: insufficient facilities and online pedagogical knowledge, unlimited memos and deadlines, insensitive policies or instructions, slow internet connection, and social media demonization. Moreover, the threat of unemployment due to low enrollment, school closures, the threat of COVID-19, especially to our families, the threat of the Duterte administration, meaning the different violations of human rights, etc., and other pre-existing problems. So teachers have to deal with personal struggles at home on top of their problems at work. According to Caroline Raico of the Philippine Medical Health Association, teachers don't get to express their struggles and emotions because they're expected to always be strong because their students and community depend on them. It is important to strengthen the resiliency in dealing with the normal stresses of life. So part naman ng students, the pandemic has aggravated the various pressures and challenges the students experience in schools and society. Although some of them, we may find some of them as shallow or superficial, I think it's important to also consider them seriously, because sometimes this very consideration or this very judgment becomes the reason why their depression aggravates. Although sometimes it must be done in moderation, because sometimes it can be used in a reactive sense or in a slavish sense, to use a phrase from Nietzsche. Last June 16, 2020, an incoming grade 9 student, a 19-year-old balik-aral learner from Albay, Philippines, committed suicide due to expenses in online classes. The victim's mother claimed that her son had been complaining about expenses for network loads or internet fees for online class. Furthermore, in an interview, the director of DepEd Bicol region said, allow me to read this, we will, according to Mr. Sansad, we will respond with the necessary actions for the victims and his family. We'll also be sending our personnel who can provide psychosocial intervention to his siblings who might be able to look, also be learners of our schools in Santo Domingo. We'll also coordinate with the DSWD for any psychosocial aid and assistance for the bereaved family. The DepEd Bicol region will implement blended learning and will be most flexible in providing alternative delivery modes to learners to help them cope with the challenges posed on education by the coronavirus pandemic. We cannot discount the fact that we also have to consider the extreme vulnerability of our learners to depression and emotional breakdowns. So I hope after this interview, things really change or things were really done. But in reality, again, let's hope that things were done. Sometimes an administrator may speak about humanitarian considerations, etc., during orientations, but afterwards, for the rest of the semester, all of the things that she or he will do or ask from us are the irony. No? So a subpart of the fourth part is depression and suicide. So this is not comprehensively written, so my apologies. Depression occurs when the speed and complexity of the flows of information overwhelm the capacity of the social brain to manage these flows, inducing a panic that concludes shortly thereafter with a depressive plunge. It's so widespread today because the contemporary organization production of surplus value is founded on the phenomenon of the accumulation of speed. In Burnout Society, Han opines, depression is the pathological expression of the late modern human being's failure to become himself or to become fast and competitive or to become positive. Yet depression also follows from impoverished attachment, which is a characteristic of the increasing fragmentation and atomization of life in society. Let me proceed. Depression is the sickness of a society that suffers from excessive positivity. It reflects a humanity waging war on itself. So similarly, suicide in the contemporary period transforms into a cultural malady. So depression and suicide, I want to argue in this paper, are cultural things. They're cultural problems. They're not merely psychological, ethnic, or ethical phenomena or problems. Suicide is spreading epidemically, especially in this time of the pandemic. According to WHO, in the last 45 years, suicide rates have increased by 60% worldwide. Although again, there are many reasons why people commit suicide, but now it has aggravated, and what's happening now is really much informed or conditioned by the conditions that we're experiencing. Semi-capitalism infiltrates the nervous cells of organisms, of students, and sometimes of teachers. It injects in them a morbid mindset, progressively taking hold of the collective unconscious, culture, and sensibility. So ito pa yung mga taong kulang sa tulog. As such, o kulang sa tulog, mahina ang internet connection. As such, the biopolitical effect of semi-capitalism is the capture of cognitive activity and the subjection of the faculty of expression of the linguistic animal to the sleepless, aggressive dynamics of labor market. So cognitariats, the students, the teachers, have been lured into the trap of creativity. Their expectations are submitted to the productivity blackmail because they're obliged to identify their soul with their work. Social conflicts and dissatisfaction are perceived as psychological failures whose effect is the destruction of self-esteem. In the time of the pandemic, all of us, feel isolated while pushed to compete. So last part, and I think this is the most important part, and this is still under construction. So what is to be done in this age of spasm? Actually, in the book Heroes, Berardi asked the question, what is to be done during a time when nothing can be done? Of course, we philosophers, mayabang tayo, tingin natin, there's always something that can be done. So one solution provided by Berardi in his book Heroes is via neuroplasticity. Specifically, it's mapping the activity of the brain while wiring the activity of the collective brain. Maybe if this is possible, then perhaps you can volunteer these people such as Rhochie, Mokauson, Antiporda, etc. Scientists, artists, and engineers will become the main actors, victims of this technological innovation. They should labor to retain humanity in the course of this transhuman transition. But can this form of technology convert into a kind? But this form of technology can convert into a kind of neuro-totalitarianism. In our goal to combine sensible and sensitive singularities that can condition freedom, sympathy, sharing among others, is always haunted by this negative possibility. Although it serves as a glimmer of hope, I think this kind of solution is not yet within the reach of people, especially in the third world countries. Tayo nga, issue pa rin natin, lockdown, mask, permits. The problems brought about by the assemblage of semi-capitalism, the COVID-19 virus, and other pre-existing socioeconomic issues are too complex to be solved by a single initiative and by single subjectivity or a group. So we need to search for new forms of solidarity in this new normal. So again, it reminds me of Nietzsche in the case of man, the modern man. What we need to do is to move forward. We cannot move backward. Maybe a good starting point can be derived from Deleuze's philosophical partner, Guattari. And I quote from Chaosmosis, all the disciplines will have to combine their creativity to ward off the ordeals of barbarism, the mental implosion of chaosmic spasms looming on the horizon, period. We have to conjure barbarism, mental implosion, chaosmic spasm. So for Guattari, in simple terms, chaosmosis means reactivation of the body of social solidarity. Because again, capitalism or semi-capitalism has this creative capacity to individualize us from the group. As well as, let me continue, of reactivation of imagination beyond the limited horizon of economic growth, philosophy, and anthropology. In short, Guattari is asking here that perhaps the solutions will not only come from philosophy, and perhaps our perspective must be beyond anthropology. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why Sir Pao mentioned or asked Sir Rhochie a while ago about the idea of becoming virus. Because becoming animal is inevitably related to becoming animal, becoming wildlife and becoming virus. So using the language of Berardi, the question in the previous paragraph, how can we develop a new sense of solidarity now, can be translated into how can we speak of solidarity or precarious ethics in a time when connectivity, one of its fundamental pillars, serves as the key reason behind the spread of the virus. In a way, this predicament has either engendered cost-oriented and civil society organizations to innovate their technology of resistance as well as urbanize the cyberspace as an equally legitimate arena of protest. But again, the cyberspace is not the only. Indeed, other forms of solidarity can be formulated outside the realm of political action, which is likewise as if solidarity is the only seat of struggle and emancipation. In fact, now, naisip ko na perhaps even solidarity is also the problem. So these are some of the suggestions that I have in mind, although they are still not fully developed. Maybe a criticism question is how to become chaoids or vectors of chaos or freedom in today's time. So again, my premise is there's no one solution, and the solutions, cannot be developed overnight, only by philosophy or only by anthropology. Perhaps we should maintain a critical distance with how media or people nowadays romanticize our resilience. Kaya natin yan, malalagpasan natin to. This also is happening in relation to the typhoon. Sometimes it becomes an excuse not to think beyond what is in front of us. We must also maintain critical distance or be critical about the limits of our compassion. Sometimes being too much compassionate to your students is also not doing good. Sometimes, I'm sorry for, I don't know, yes, I agree that depression is really, and suicide are serious issues, but sometimes, I think some students, sana naman hindi lahat, some of them use this as a reason to escape certain responsibilities. Other solution is becoming slow, maybe detaching yourself a little from screen contact. Maybe the proper term is what I place in the next part, detoxifying or moderating or organizing your digital life. Kasi nakakainis minsan kung i-email ka ng sunod-sunod ng isang office, tapos mag-email pa yung nabawasan mo yung files mo sa tapos magme-message pa yung students mo, tapos magme-message pa yung mga kamag-anak mo. We need to detoxify, we need to organize. And maybe even though there are many problems brought about by the pandemic, it also gives us maybe a source of glimmer of hope. It also gives us more time with our loved ones. For example, with my child, Gino. Hindi puro screen, hindi puro YouTube. Since now we have transferred to a farm, or our house now is in a farm. Dati, ang alam niya sa cow ay ganitong sound, ganito yung itsura, but now, nakakita na siya ng totoong baka, totoong kambing, nakakahawak na siya ng lupa. Sometimes these things, though simple, are sources of perhaps, it detoxifies us from the different pressures we have. So you can also consult with your students. You also converse with your loved ones. Siguro it gives us more time to converse with them. And if you have certain resources, you can share, etc., etc. But I forgot to mention the fourth part. I think this is crucial. Many people still doubt the possibility of developing or promoting critical thinking or critical encounter in the cyberspace. But I think, again, using Deleuze and Guattari, we cannot deny the fact that digital revolution is really here. That's why we must make it a point, or we must just maximize this potentiality to create opportunities for genuine educational encounters. But of course, we must always remain vigilant that sometimes these encounters can translate into certain forms of deception, of totalization, or of manipulation. Let me end my presentation with the statement. So despite the hope offered to us by various vaccines in America, in Europe, in China, from China, created to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, let's not forget that this pandemic is not merely physiological or medical problem. Taking a cue from Latour, and this was quoted by Zizek in this recent interview, this pandemic is only a small sample of the real crisis that will come later. Other viruses, global catastrophes, and above all, global warming. So here are my sources, some of the sources. So yun lang po. Maraming salamat po.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Reyes. So this time we are accepting questions already. As mentioned, we have 10 to 15 minutes. So is there anyone who would like to start? Yes, po. I think I heard this. Or we can begin with the question in the chat from Sir Alvin Tan. It says here, thank you for your interesting presentation, Doc.
Ibasa na lang, thank you.
Sige po. Can you hear me po?
Yeah.
Okay. My simple question is, how do we deal with any burnt out society? Is there any solution you can suggest without necessarily creating any formulaic remedy?
I'm sorry, what's the last part? Without
necessarily creating any formulaic remedy. Formula or something like that.
Yeah. Hello, Sir Alvin. Actually, the last part is about that. I provided some of the ways, and let me go to the last part. Siguro, Sir Alvin, kumakain ka habang discuss ko to. I'm just kidding, no? Some of the ways, to make sense, not really to solve, Kasi if you are going to hope nowadays, it's, again, I'm not really a fan of Zizek, but if you're going to hope today, it's a kind of paradoxical hope, negative hope. It's really impossible to go to the previous. So what we can do is to perhaps make sense of our limited resources right now, and these are some of the solutions that I provide. But like I said, all these solutions can anytime transform into perhaps additional problems in the long run. That's why, like I said, we need to create or make sense of educational platform as an arena, as a fluid arena for critical discussion, critical thinking, but we must always be vigilant that sometimes our strategies, our modes of assessments, these have the possibilities of turning into totalitarian ones, limited ones, one-size-fits-all ones. It's not bad to provide solutions, but maybe because of the conditions now, we must always be ready that these conditions can only serve as band-aids. Because capitalism is not, semi-capitalism is not only, it does not only work in a molar sense. What makes it very dangerous is its molecular configuration. And these possible or working solutions are, I formulated them to perhaps combat these molecular configurations or kinds of oppressions provided by, directly or indirectly, by semi-capitalism and aggravated by the pandemic. Sa digital platforms, sa discussions, sa online learning, I think the possibilities are limited. But sometimes, we are not able to maintain the pacing, maintain the momentum, or kumbaga minsan napaka-high-tech ng solution mo, napaka-creative ng method mo para ituro yung isang subject, pero yung pala hindi naman natututo yung mga estudyante mo. Kaya nga minsan, sabi ko nga kanina rito, one way is by becoming slow. Sometimes hindi yung even before the pandemic, even before this online obsession thing, no, parang we already suffering this problem. No? Nagmamadali tayo sa curriculum, kailangan may outcomes-based, etc. Kasi sila pinaprepare as workers, no, in the making. Pero we are not sure whether the students are really learning or whether the assessment task really would test whether they really learn the subject or would simply aggravate their pre-existing problems. So, sana Sir Alvin, may sense yung sagot ko. These are just working solutions. And perhaps some of them will become also sources of problems in the long run. But as philosophers, may abang tayo, kailangan mabigay natin kahit paano, no? Especially now, no? A sense of hope, sense of solution, without being teleological. So I hope, Sir.
Salamat, sir. Salamat, Doc. Salamat.
Yeah, ingat dyan.
Nag-email ako sa'yo.
Yeah, sige. Basta
Okay.
walang picture, ha?
Wala. Alright. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Doc.
you.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Anyone else who would like to ask Dr. Reyes?
Sir Allison, can I?
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Hindi ko sasagutin yung tanong ni Sir Pao Rhochie. Joke lang.
I-chat mo sa akin.
Yeah. Mahirap dito, Rhochie.
Lagyan mo ng picture na. Ang tanong ko is,
Pag nakita tayo sa distribution ng papaliwanag ko sa iyo yung sinasabi ni Sir Pao. Kalahating ka ba ng bigas ang kapalit?
ganun ba? Ang tanong ko is, kasi wala tayong choice eh. Actually, lahat is ano yan? Have to course through itong digital means. Walang option, walang choice eh. And then siguro makararamdam din yung iba sa akin. Yun na nga, sometimes you have this thinking na yes, you're compassionate in a sense na baka mahina ang signal and so on. So yung lumalaro sa isip ko is how can we assure na they are at the other end of the line? Kasi minsan, tanungin ko sila, you still there? Wala. Sa simula na doon. Sa discussion ng bandang dulo, wala na. So that's one, no? Then nabanggit mo yung digital divide. No? Talagang mas naramdaman, lalo na nitong panahon ng pandemic. Yan. Meron naman talagang legitimately hindi makapasok, hindi makahabol sa lesson dahil talagang from the parts of the world, of the country, hindi maabot yung ganong Mbps, yung speed. Ngayon, ang tanong ko is, plus tayo din, mga teachers. I feel you, no? Yung sinasabi mo, no? Ang daming requirements at the same time, ganyan, turuan mo si ganito, ganyan, may submit ka, attend meeting at the same time, webinar and so on. Sabay-sabay yun. Yan. So, ramdam natin lahat. Ang tanong ko, paano kaya, I was wondering, ano kaya ang magiging resulta? Ano kaya ang magiging produkto? O anong klaseng mga estudyante kaya tayo meron ngayon in the next, 10 or 5 years? Meron ka bang, anong take mo doon? Kasi minsan napapag-usapan din natin na ito bang SEM na to ay pamigay na lang? O ito bang SEM na to ay napakadali para sa kanila? Ano kaya? I was wondering, in the next 5 or 10 years, ano kaya yung mga produkto natin? Yun lang. Hindi ko I'm still thinking, ano kayang klaseng produkto? Anong klaseng learning ang meron kaya sila? Yun lang. Anong take mo doon?
Actually, it's a very difficult question. No? Na I think cannot be answered merely by using philosophy or this limited platform. No? Of course, ang masasabi ko lang is pwede ako mag-speculate na siguro una is that inevitably, kung nasa new normal na tayo, sana hindi magkatotoo to, no? Na baka talagang hindi natin maiiwasan yung nagtuturo tayo, tapos yung estudyante, hati na yung atensyon, no? Nakaharap sa screen, nakaharap sa atin. Di ba, before the pandemic, gano'n na nangyayari, pero tingin ko, mas lalala yun, no? Yun nga, pag nakatutok sila sa screen, pwede silang tumingin sa kung ano-anong bagay, mas lalong magiging question yung attention nila. And siguro, pati yung idea ng hindi ko na i-develop itong maigi din kanina, sabi ko nga, no, bata pa lang, naging problematic na yung empathy nila, sense of empathy. So siguro mas magiging ganito yung mga, sana hindi, no? May mga estudyanteng mas magiging questionable yung kanilang empathy, pagrespeto sa teacher. Siguro hindi na ito masyado maliligo, mag-aayos. Just recently sa Facebook, may parang surreal way of thinking what will happen after, no? So may mga estudyanteng pumapasok sa parang inaano lang nila what will happen after the pandemic, no? May mga estudyanteng nakaupo lang sa likod, harap sa screen, walang pakialam sa ano. But these are inevitables, no? Pero yun nga, since as philosophers, alam natin na posibleng mangyari itong mga bagay na to, so siguro gumawa tayo ng paraan, although ang dali kong sabihin, no? Using this limited digital platform to maybe emphasize the value of intersubjective relation, solidarity, using this technological platform. I don't know kung may sense pa yung mga sinasabi ko. No? Ang hirap eh. In a way, swerte pa nga tayo kasi kahit paano philosophy yung tinuturo natin. Pero tingin ko sa ibang subjects, mas challenging eh. No? Halimbawa, diba nga, recently sa Facebook may joke video na nagpapa-final exam daw yung teacher na nagsuswimming, parang PE ata ng swimming, nagda-dive siya sa higaan niya. Nakakatawa siya, pero what about yung mga subjects na may laboratory? What about yung mga subjects na kailangan talaga ng touch? No? Hindi ko alam kung ano maging epekto sa kanilang educational learning, no? Pag naging normal na lahat, no? Mga subjects such as ano ba, may mga botany, may mga zoology. Pero yun nga, hindi mo naman kailangan mapunta sa ganung subject para maging in question yung mga corporeal or sensible faculties na to. No? Kasi since the advent of technology, nagiging problematic na siya. Yun nga lang, na-aggravate siya ngayon. No? Hindi ko alam, Sir Rhochie, kung may nasuggest akong solusyon, pero yun nga, siguro, ako tatanungin mo, ang pagbubutihan ko na lang muna, although I'm not sure of what will happen, is how to become slow. Sa tinuturo ko, dahan-dahan. Yun nga lang, there are always reasons no, to affect our momentum. Just yesterday, no, Wednesday, no, maniniwala ka ba na parang third synchronous session ko pa lang sa class ko sa second half, no? Kasi Monday, Wednesday, kung di bagyo, November 1, etc., etc. No? So kahapon, I was about to introduce the new topic. It's on Adorno. No? Pero ang previous topic namin na hindi namin napag-usapan, meron lang asynchronous video, kay Nietzsche. No? Nung bandang huli, sabi ko sa kanila, gusto nyo bang mag-proceed tayo o may mga tanong pa kayo? Pero hindi ko sinabi that their question should be limited only to Nietzsche. No? Sabi ko, baka may general concerns kayo about life, etc., etc. So, natapos namin siguro yung 2 hours nung nag-uusap lang about life, about philosophy, no? Para lang kahit paano, makamusta ko sila, kung okay pa ba sila, while indirectly interjecting the lesson, no? So, siguro that's one way to, hindi ko alam masagot doon sa tanong mo.
Salamat, sir.
Maybe we can only use small band-aids, no?
Hindi ko talagang maisip na ano kaya yung mga solutions, nakuha ko yung mga sinasabi mo eh. Ano kaya ang produkto nila in the next 10 or 5 years compared dun sa ano. Anyway, sige, ano lang naman yan na pag-isip ko lang. Salamat, sir. Salamat.
Yeah. Salamat.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry, is this Mr. or Miss Teng Miharo? Pero you may ask your question po. I'm sorry.
Ay, okay. Actually, comment lang. More of ano lang ito. Actually, wala naman kwenta talaga ito sasabihin ko. But it's more of comment on, kasi I also read the Burnout Society. And I find it interesting when Dr. Reyes mentions about the idea of depression, because what's different from Han is that he also provides a philosophical background as to how depression can be understood. And I think that's a key notion that Dr. Reyes mentioned, because there's this thing, a pathological reduction of depression. And but anxiety, could could also be understood, although not totally the same, but could also be understood aligned with the idea of depression. And also on that, in Burnout Society, I think Han also quotes a novelist, no, by the name of Hanke, specifically the essay written by Hanke on tiredness. And I think that's also, I also agree with Dr. Reyes' observation. I think the real reason why there's a problem as well in online teaching is that we're expecting students to achieve, no, uh, which is also one of the premise of the burnout society. So siguro yung idea na parang kahit sa isang online platform, gusto natin silang mag-achieve kahit medyo hindi ganoon ka hindi kasi hindi pa sila sanay sa ganoon platform, at siguro it's a more of an institutional yung siguro problem din. Like yung for example, UST has this expectation that students would learn the same way in an online platform versus a face-to-face. So parang ganun. So kaya yung in the burnout society, beyond the disciplinary society of Foucault, I think Han is saying that we are now in an achievement society that makes us all tired. Parang ganun. Thank you.
Salamat, Sir. No? Actually, hindi ko pa siya natatapos, no? Pero yun nga, I really agree with that. No? Parang we're always expected to be competitive, to be fast, to be mobile. But all of these expectations are just, they're just parang originally attributes of global or circuit transmitters. No? But the problem is, like I said a while ago, our human brain is still, even though it can do impossible or infinite things, no, it's always conditioned by the limits of our bodies. And when this becomes a problem, then it would give different kinds of problems to the individual. Napupuyat, hindi kumakain, nai-stress. And mind you guys, no, last semester, no, meron akong estudyante na, kasi gusto ko talaga oral exam. So meron akong estudyante na in our prelims and finals, sasabihin sa mga classmates niya na wala siyang kuryente, mahina yung internet connection niya, wala nung first half naman, wala pa naman masyadong bagyo, no? Ngayon siguro maniniwala ako, no? Tapos biglang sa klase, mag-join siya for some minutes. Siya lagi yung nauuna, no? After 5 minutes, this person left the meeting, etc., etc., no? So, of course, as a teacher, siguro mas may oras tayo ngayon. Tinanong ko yung mga kaklase niya, ano yung nangyayari, tinanong ko yung mga kaibigan niya, ano yung problema, ganun rin ba siya sa ibang subjects, kasi as a teacher, that's normal, no? May nagsabi na sa ilang subjects, sir, ganun siya. Then siguro natanong ko lang one time na, tika saan ba siya? Bakit niya problem lagi yung internet connection? Bakit brownout lagi? I learned that he/she is from Cavite. And pareho kami ng town, at nagtataka ako na wala namang brownout dito. Parang 2 barangay lang yung pagitan namin. No? So lumabas pala na, yun nga, sabi ko nga, mas may oras ako during that time. Yung problema niya pala is, parang yung reason niya na internet problem, brownout, are just parang, and usually ganito naman ang mga, may cases ng depression, no? May mga, defense mechanisms, no? Kaya siguro, I walked further, I asked for her number, and I don't think this is really advisable, no? At kinausap ko siya, no? Nasabi ko to no critical theory conference, no? Kinamusta ko lang siya, no? Ano yung nangyayari, etc., etc. Then, of course, I did not directly start with, hello, this will count as your formal oral exam in the finals. So sabi ko nung sa seminar nung critical theory, kinausap ko lang siya, then unti-unti kong creatively, no, tinanong siya about certain things, no, without losing grip dun sa concern niya sa buhay, hanggang na-expose nga na she's suffering from depression, at parang the mere fact na yung idea ay online learning, talagang nai-stress daw siya, no? Hindi ko pwedeng sabihin during that time, and this was my point why I wrote positive toxicity a while ago, na kapag ganitong sitwasyon, hindi mo pwede sabihin na kaya mo yan, malalagpasan natin, no? So sabi ko nga, sometimes this resiliency, this banality of resiliency becomes a further barrier, no, for you to listen or for them to share something. And then yun nga, biglang natapos na lang yung usapan namin, and at the same time, natapos na rin yung oral exam, but it's not really a strict or formal oral exam, no? But at least nalaman ko na, although some would still see this as shallow or ano, na may mga ganun pa rin naman talaga, at minsan talagang you need to spend more time, no, to search for them. And yun nga, sa classroom nga na face-to-face, ang hirap nang malaman kung sino sila, what more today, no? Kaya it's really challenging not only to students but also to teachers, no? Kaya nga, I really appreciate these health breaks, or I really appreciate the initiative created by this organization in UST na suggesting the administrators, no, not only to have this health break but also to slow down, because these administrators are too much into metrics, outputs, deadlines, etc., etc. Now, although I'm not really sure whether it really became the effect or really the consequences really became successful, but that very initiative is a good thing. Pero nga, sana nga, even this work in progress, no, I hope, no, all these things, no, would also reach, no, their ears. At the end of the day, yung isa matututo about philosophy will say compassion in the orientation, pero kapag naramdaman niya ulit na he or she is powerful at kailangan may ma-achieve, kailangan may report, kailangan may memo, patay na naman tayo dyan. No? In short, this is a collective effort, no? Because the problem is collective, molecular. That's why I think it necessitates a collective effort, no, from all of us, because all of us are victims. So salamat Sir Einstein, no, sa sharing mo. Sana matapos ko rin in the future yung libro before I get burned out.
You're welcome, Doc.
Is there last question in the chat? It says here, could we say therefore that capitalism has saved us from the effects of the pandemic by providing us a competitive environment that created the technology to communicate?
Thank you, Sir Bob. Of course, I'm coming from critical theory, specifically French and Italian, German critical theory, no. Yan to Sir Bob, no. It's not an A or B question kasi, no, that needs or that deserves an A or B answer, no. What I think is that in a way the pandemic exposes the limits of capitalism, but at the same time it also exposes us to the idea that the problems in the world now are not only authored by capitalism. I think our anthropological hubris of objectifying the world goes as far as the Enlightenment period, as early as the ancient period. So the pandemic, in a way, it ends, no, at the same time exposes different problems. At the same time, it also necessitates us, no, that these problems will, parang the solutions to these problems, no, will not only come from one perspective, from one principle, from one field. But at the end of the day, we should remember that even though initially the pandemic problem, which is a problem not only of economic but also of anthropology, of the Anthropocene, exposes the limits of capitalism. But as time proceeds, this aspect of capitalism, which is called surveillance capitalism, was also able to arrest the situation. So because of this contact tracing, the more surveillance capitalism, parang it becomes more powerful. And the problem is when the power of surveillance capitalism becomes more powerful, other poles of power were also able to grab it and convert it, no, into their own benefit, no. Kaya nga siguro ngayon mas mas biktima tayo ng surveillance, mas alam ng tao kung saan ng system ng estado kung ano ang gagawin natin. Our bodies are limited, our gestures are limited. So that's my complex answer to your question, sir. No? So it's not a simple yes or no answer, no? Kasi even capitalism is an assemblage of many things, no? And capitalism is not entirely bad. It's not also, it also has some emancipatory powers. But the problem is, and I'm coming from, in this case, from Deleuze and Guattari, even though it is emancipatory in the sense that it can emancipate us from old practices, old values, the problem is this kind of emancipation it offers can also only leads to its further strengthening or further fortification rather than the production of new kinds of people, new kinds of sensibility, or new kinds of solidarity.
And that is also dangerous, ano?
Yeah, yes sir. It's very dangerous po.
Galing. Sige, thank you.
Salamat po, Sir Bob.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reyes, for your response as well as for your presentation. Sir Franz, may I share my screen na po? We can move to the last
Salamat po.
presentation. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Salamat, Allison.
Can you see the screen po?
Yes, sir. Kita po.
Okay, thank you, sir. Hi, good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'll be reading to you the background of the study of my thesis proposal. I actually presented this one, I think 2 sessions ago, although this one is the revised version of that one. Right, so I'll begin. The title of my thesis proposal is Utopia and Possibilities for Social Change, Herbert Marcuse's activist model of critical theory. This proposed research aims to reconstruct Marcuse's activist model of critical theory. This is predicated on the lack of any sustained and organized discussion on Marcuse's different approach to critical theory, which focuses mainly on the possibilities for social change. Unfortunately, Marcuse's presence in contemporary discussions declined after the 60s, but the repressive tendencies of the capitalist system had only become even more far-reaching, especially now with extreme advancements in science and technology and social media, which have damaged the individual's critical impulse and pursuit for social change. It appears that amidst all these, Marcuse's contemporary relevance and critical spirit, especially on realizing the possibilities for social change, has been impeded and to some degree forgotten, while the forces of domination and repression in advanced capitalist societies have outgrown the past. Given this, I will argue, following Marcuse, that critique of society and conceiving utopian visions are necessary conditions in evoking possibilities for social change. Moreover, I will argue that for possibilities for social change to be actualized, going beyond critique and utopian visions through an actual struggle for liberation is necessary. Such is best embodied by Marcuse's The Great Refusal, which can be in the form of activism. In One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse clearly presents the culture and rationality of one-dimensionality in society, constituted of individuals bereft of critical impulse. In the book, he presents a world where progress in science and technology and increasing material wealth have drastically improved people's lives since abundant resources are available and technological innovations that aid individuals in producing more goods and services are within our reach. However, the problem is that despite the advancements seen in the contemporary society, especially in democratic and wealthy societies, pathological conditions remained and to some extent had become even more appalling. Normalization of warfare, extreme waste production, denying of a minority group's rights, and the like have been increasingly normalized as byproducts of this progress society so willfully takes pride in. Individuals have become complicit to their very own subjugation by adhering to the values and norms of the system, that is, prioritizing scientific and economic progress at the expense of freedom and happiness. Marcuse reasons that this is largely because capitalism has brought privileges and excessive satisfaction to individuals to the point where questioning the problematic and irrational system has become almost unnecessary. It is also important to note that privileges that have been presented to individuals through technology, entertainment, and the like have blinded those that consume in a market-dominated society, all the way from universities up to the government. In other words, the repression and domination of a highly capitalist-driven society, Marcuse asserts, has become damaging to the extent that one's critical impulse is gradually taken away from the individual as he gets absorbed and assimilated into the system. Now, for Marcuse, critique and utopian visions are necessary conditions in evoking possibilities for social change. Critique or negative thinking, a kind of thinking that breaks away from the traditional ethos of merely accepting ideas and existing conditions at face value, is a necessary mode of thinking in negating the existing injustices and domination in society. It engages in questioning the underlying rationality of the realities in society. It allows one to challenge the conditions in the status quo and evokes alternative realities. This involves a criticism of society's conditions in the hope of highlighting what is rational and what is not. Moreover, as critique or negative thinking dialectically exposes the anomalies of the status quo, it rejects the state it is currently in. Subsequently, by exposing the intolerable existing conditions of humanity through critique, it opens images and visions of emancipation and a better life. Interestingly, maintaining one's ability to imagine or conceive utopian visions is something that Marcuse held on to because it provided a promise that what is actual is not necessarily what ought to be. As negative thinking or critique brings forth visions of emancipation, it guides individuals to having alternative perspective of what is in the status quo, perhaps a development of utopian visions. Such for Marcuse is necessary in one's consciousness, but similar to the disposition of critique in a one-dimensional society, he mentions that people despise and denigrate utopian thoughts because they are afraid to lose their scientific character or validity behind their work. However, he reasons that all the more is utopia needed because seeing how the world has become problematic and perverted as a consequence of an utterly repressive society suggests the need for another more livable place for individuals. As Angela Davis powerfully puts it, this is not the way things are supposed to be. This might be the way they are now, but they are not supposed to be this way. They will not always be this way. This tells us that despite the intolerable conditions in society, there will always be a means to transform them because they are not always like that and are not supposed to remain that way. Hence, imagination takes us far and invites us to ponder that if historically society has been changing, then the current conditions are also subject to change. Indeed, critique and having utopian visions are necessary in evoking possibilities for social change. But following that discussion, I argue that critique and utopian visions are not enough if we are to transform society. For Marcuse, in as much as exposing the appalling conditions of society and developing utopian thought is itself emancipatory, there must be a way to actualize the possibilities for social change. This is best embodied by Marcuse's notion of the Great Refusal, which is a political individualistic refusal and revolt against the system of domination and oppression exacted with a bourgeois society. Actualizing the possibilities for social change through the Great Refusal happens when individuals concretely struggle for the liberation they deserve as a result of seeing the contradictions and developing utopian visions that allowed them to imagine a different potential world for all. Such was the case, for example, when the student movement broke out in the 60s. Marcuse paid close attention to the movement and even participated in some of its sit-ins. These protests were directed toward a plethora of issues at the time, from the Vietnam War to Black individuals' human rights, among other things. Oddly enough, this catapulted Marcuse's name in the public eye and even became recognized by many as the father of the New Left because of his unrelenting commitment in supporting protest movements, both in writing and as an intellectual and participating on the ground. As Rick Roderick mentions in one of his lectures on Marcuse, philosophers do not enjoy being advocates for any position that matter usually, but Marcuse is an advocate. Ultimately, in Marcuse, we see Fury's constant engagement with social movements, allowing for the necessary readjustments of Fury, providing a way to open and unblock the restrictions that a Fury may have if it keeps scrupulously above the real ground of political movements. We infer that for Marcuse, negative thinking and Utopia are significant, but can also offer so much more. They inform us of the possibilities of radically transforming society. Fast forward to the present, and we see various forms of the Great Refusal in contemporary social movements, protests, and activism around the world. These are concrete struggles of people that have seen and felt the pathologies of society, and in the process, developed an image of a better and more livable world. Hence, Marcuse's contemporary relevance and critical spirit lives on after many decades, especially on actualizing the possibilities for social change. In the final analysis, it appears that Marcuse's activist model of critical fury contains a powerful message about the possibility of attaining concrete social transformation. We can see that Marcuse's negative thinking, as most critical theorists in his time did, exposed the anomalies and perversions visible that were not recognized by many. Indeed, this awareness of society's irrationality under the guise of rationality is of principal value, as it opens our minds to imagining alternatives or simply developing utopia. However, this utopia must be realized through concrete struggles in attaining to liberation, which is best embodied by his notion of the Great Refusal. Unfortunately, this aspect of Marcuse's scholarship has been overlooked and deliberately brushed off by many scholars/critical theorists. In no small part, the decline of Marcuse's prominence and relevance can be attributed to the considered failure of the student movement and the New Left in the 60s. However, with the contemporary social movements that we see now, Marcuse's critical spirit and radical philosophy are called once more. Indeed, Marcuse has never been this relevant since the 60s. It is for this reason that I aim to reconstruct Marcuse's activist model of critical fury. Now, by reconstructing his activist model of critical fury, the paper hopes to contribute to the liberation of one's mind, a precondition for a freer and more humane society. It also attempts to communicate the idea that perhaps utopia is not an unattainable perfect world, but a better world that can be attained so long as the hope and the will to get there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sir Allison. So we're opening the session for suggestions, questions, clarifications. Just to have a time check, it's already 8:42 na po, 8:42. So we have ilan pa? 18 minutes for exchange. Tingnan natin from ito. Allison, there is a comment / question from Sir Alvin Tan. And so generally, society can be civil, but not necessarily humane. Only the individual can be humane. Since hegemony is primordial in any society, how can we create or even imagine any close parenthesis, human society if it cannot, at the very least, be humane, its intent and content? Yan. You can ask clarification if you want. No, I think Sir Alvin is around. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm still trying to understand the question. Yeah. Or perhaps Sir Alvin could clarify before I respond, just to be sure on my response.
Sir Alvin, you there? Sir Alvin?
Hello, sir. Hello, Sir Allison.
Hi, sir.
Yes. Kasi pagka pinaliwanag ko, baka mas lalong makomplicate eh. Kaya pinag-isipan ko maigi yung tanong. Since the individual, otherwise I would simply be repetitive. Babasahin ko lang din yung tanong ko. Since society itself cannot be humane. Kasi masyadong abstract yung lipunan eh. Only the person can be humane and civil at the same time. So how can we at least imagine any kind of human society which cannot be humane in the first place? Kasi parang sinasabi si Marcuse, at least the way I understand it, you have to create at least an ideal society. Parang meron tayong ideal form para in a way that would initiate some sort of social change. Parang that's how I see your presentation po. So, yun nga, balik tayo doon sa tanong ko. So, any society that we create can be civil but not necessarily humane in its intent and content. So, parang self-defeating. Dapat pa tayo gagawa ng lipunan kung hindi naman makatao ang ginagawang mga batas na ginagawa. Di ba? Parang ganun. So, yung tao lang, on the individual level, kumbaga, it's like, mas konkreto yung solusyon kapag taong pinag-uusapan kaysa lipunan. Kasi lipunan napaka-abstract eh. Hindi mo alam kung saan ka magsisimula eh. Pero pag nagsimula ka sa konkretong tao, sa tao mismo, yun makikita mo. Meron kang malinaw na tugon. Na yun lang naman po. Salamat po.
Hey, thank you, sir. Yeah, I think parang medyo na-gets yung question na. I think, yeah, individualistic development is good. Like the individual should develop for example, principles that can help society. But I also think that individualism is not enough. For example, when we talk about, let's say, Black individuals in America being oppressed by police officers, we cannot just prosecute, or we cannot just pressure the government to put these police officers in jail for example, justice of those people who were victimized by these policemen. For society to function well, and for these Black people, for example, to be accepted in society, there has to be systemic change in the institution itself, which is very much influenced by racism, like how most policemen in America are very much, tied with the culture of racism. It's so far as when you are a Black person in America, when you have marijuana, it's so easy for you to get caught and be jailed or be put in prison. But if you're a white person in America committing the same crime, you don't get the same kind of punishment. And so individualistic, when you just, for example, correct the individual policeman for what he did, I don't think it changes the society. But I think when you try to refuse the system and demand solutions, demand changes, for example, that police as an institution, or that the cops, for example, as a collective should change their attitude on Black people, I think that creates more of a humane society. It doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect humane society, because I think I agree there's really this tendency to I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to really have a very humane society, but we can always demand certain changes, even within institutions. It doesn't just have to be individualistic. Yeah, I hope that somehow makes sense. I just made connected it to an example to make it more concrete, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank you, sir. Thank you, po.
Thank you, Sir Alvin, Sir Allison. Any more questions, comments, input? Sige sir, habang formulate sila, no, bigla ko lang naisip, based on your exchange with Sir Alvin, ano yung nakikita mo in the Philippine setting? How can you equate this, or is there such? Baka naman wala. I mean, in terms of discrimination and so on. At kung meron man, how do you think that model can somehow address that in a concrete and realizable way? Yun po.
yeah, I don't think we have the same level of, for example, discrimination um, with, for example, with that of Black people in America. Of course, there's still certain discriminatory instances in the Philippines with women, with gay people, with Muslims even sometimes. So I think we have this problems too, but I think it's not as grave or as excessive as the Black people, for example, in America experience. But I think one thing that I could mention, if not, kasi nga hindi ko masyadong ma-equate siya, but I think, for example, just the fact that when you oppose the government, you're immediately red tagged, you're immediately called a communist or a rebellion a rebel, for example, sorry. I think that's one way of how Philippine society has become repressive, how the government, for example, is not open to questioning, to demands, to criticisms, because the moment you do that, you're immediately or easily red tagged with, for example, like the celebrities like Liza Soberano or Catriona Gray. They were just talking about women's rights, but it's so easy for people in power or people in position to tell them that they are NPA or that they are communists. So it seems that the environment of discussion, the environment of having an open mind on discussing environmental issues, women's rights, gender issues, and things like that, we don't have enough space for that because the government seems to have this tendency to be quote unquote fascist, which is not exactly fascistic, but just their tendencies, which I find in the Philippine society. So I think with Marcuse, what we can get from Marcuse is this idea that we cannot allow that to continue to exist. That's why the great refusal, for example, can be a useful, I don't know, it's not a concrete tool, obviously, pero it could be a useful, well, I don't know, it could be a useful tool in changing our mindset na we don't always need to conform to the government. We don't always need to say yes all the time. That as citizens, we have enough rights to, we have enough rights to protest also. We have enough rights to protest through writing and scholarship or being in the streets, for example. It doesn't have to be always in the streets. It can be online. It can be radical scholarship if you're a radical scholar, for example. So I think there are many ways, but yeah, I think that's how I would probably relate Marcuse in the contemporary Philippine society right now. I don't know if
Salamat, sir. Yeah. Make a lot of sense. Opo. Yeah. So by this time, meron pa ba tayong katanungan? Comments? Guys still there? Okay, habang nagpo-formulate pa sila ng kanilang million-dollar question, ang naalala ko, kasi kaya ko natanong sa iyo yon, from our end, educators, paano ba? At home, yung tinutukoy ni Sir Raniel kanina, what could be the concrete action where we can really that somehow manifest? No? Kasi naalala ko yung, I keep on imagining the scenario no, when Emerita Quito, in the height of martial law, ganun siya ka-convincing, ganun siya and she was teaching Marcuse, if I'm not mistaken. No? And then, correct me, baka po may mga nakaalala yung anecdote. And then, students literally stood up and went to the streets. I mean, I can't imagine myself sending my students, let's go out and let's say, go against and so on. Ngayon, anong nangyayari? Ito yung sinasabi niya bureaucracy kanina ni Sir Raniel. Okay, punta tayo ng Moraita. Meron tayong bibisitayong eskwelahan. Ganun lang, no? Wala pang 1 kilometro. We have to undergo paper, waiver. We have to ask father kung sino ganyan, no? Regent. Ang dami, no? So hindi ko ma-imagine that time, no? And Marcuse was the topic then, and that was the height of martial law. And when you protest, that's tantamount identified to pwede kang madukot, no? Incarceration or what. I mean, these things are easier said than done. Pero
yes.
Without people, I don't know, Mandela ba? And saan nakuha ni Mandela yun? Greatest evil is when you let evil, progress without you saying anything. Yeah, without you refusing to the very cause of oppression. Yan, sige. So, any suggestions, comments from the audience? You can write it there.
Sir, ako po meron.
Sige po, we can entertain one last. May I know? Aldrin, sir, go ahead po.
Yes, sir. In response po, hindi po ako si Allison, sorry sir, pero in response po dun sa sinabi niyo po kanina, galing po sa ating educators. I think, sir, from our end po, pero meron din pong disclaimer na parang kasi yung administration din po, nililimitahan po tayo doon po sa kaya po nating ibigay na space. Pero parang, so far po nakikita ko po in my observation since I just started teaching as well is sometimes we as educators limit the space or at the same time in learning opportunities for students to see even yung parang to take action or to feel empathy, to be vigilant. Parang pati po yun kasi mismo tayo pong teachers ay minsan parang nire-restrict po natin yung opportunity for this type of learning. And as kahit for example po sa teacher certification program na lang po, parang meron pong law na mismo mga teachers po ay hindi pwedeng magbigay ng kanilang political stance pagdating po dun sa mga bagay-bagay. Tapos meron din pong parang mapapahamak din po yung mga educators if they provide their stance. Tapos meron din pong red tagging mismo sa loob po ng university or mismo sa loob po ng mga institutional agenda. Tapos parang nagiging power politics po na matatanggal ka po sa school dahil pag sinabi mo yung position mo regarding yung political problems ng Pilipinas. So parang, ayun po, parang medyo sabog po yung pagkakasabi ko. Pero parang, ang point ko po is parang batak po tayo as educators, binabatak po tayo ng admin, binabatak po tayo ng gobyerno, tapos parang pati po yung mga estudyante natin, parang binabatak din natin na mangyari sa kanila yung pagbabatak sa atin, na parang we're not giving enough space for them to learn about these things as well.
If I may add also, sir, I think Marcuse would say specifically that this is like the effort of the bureaucratic system. This is the effort of the neoliberal project, for example, to repress people. Like there has to be there has to be limitations on what you can do, and in that way you are silenced, in that way you are repressed, in that way you are forced or pushed not to go in the streets or not to write something critical through your scholarship, for example. So I think Marcuse would say that the same thing happened during his time, the same thing is happening right now. But that's why I think there's hope, because given how difficult that is, or given how difficult the system is, we still see that there are a lot of students, we still see that there are a lot of groups, we still see that there are minorities who continue to fight, because we could easily give up anytime, right? We could easily just surrender, but people do not wish to surrender. People do not choose to do that. And so I think there's always hope. Now, the question is there assurance that we can attain what we actually want? Obviously, there isn't, but I think just because there's no assurance doesn't mean certain people should not try at least. Because, for example, with the Black movement, it took hundreds of years, it took decades for the Black people to be quote unquote liberated, right, from the slave trade, for example, up to now. So I think people need to realize that there's no immediate results. We have been taught by capitalism that immediate results are there when you open Netflix, when you open Instagram, when you open Twitter, everything is instant. But I think we need to recognize that struggling for social change, struggling for justice, struggling for happiness will not be an overnight effort, will not be an overnight thing. So people had to struggle for hundreds of years, people had to struggle for decades, and they don't even get to experience that. But the future generation gets to experience that. And I think that in itself is a testimony to how, efforts can lead to something. Yeah. So I think, I think Marcuse would probably say it also better, pero something like that.
Yeah, sana Allison, sana all, no? Sana dumami ka. These things are easier said than done.
Yes, sir. That's right.
There's also a, very, very quickly, allow me, no? A danger also na sumakay dito yung sa issue, no, sa advocacy na ito, sa prinsipyo na ito. Minsan sinasakyan nila para makaabuso din. Minsan na rin ako na victim ng discrimination, no? At mga Black people ang actually mga mas mas mga matatapang at ng belittling Asians. Anyway, sige po, Sir Franz, I think we can conclude from here yung session with Sir Allison. Pero allow me po to do a plugging. Nilagay ko po dyan, nakasulat po. Saturday ang our last installment ng Ethics in Action. Nandiyan din po yung link. Pag may oras po kayo, you join us 9 to 12 po. Si Vice President Rene Robredo po yung aming speaker. I think with Sir Rene, bukas naman yata, VP Lenny is with him. Anyway, Sir Franz, sige po, I'll turn over po the floor to you. Thank you very much. Attend daw si Digong.
Attend sino?
Si Digong, sabi ni Doc Raniel, attend daw si Digong.
Okay. Thank you, partner. Kami po ni Rhochie ang mag-partner bukas sa sa pag-moderate ng forum.
Saturday.
Ano ba bukas? Friday lang pala bukas. I was thinking it's already Saturday. So if you are free po on Saturday, you are invited. You may join us, but specifically 9:30, from 9:30 to 10:30. VP Lenny is answering some questions coming from the participants of the course Ethics in Action. So yun po. Muli, maraming salamat po sa lahat ng pumunta dito. Especially to our presenters, Dr. Rhochie Matienzo, Dr. Raniel Reyes, Sir Rene Tadle, and Allison Ladero. Maraming salamat. For our next, our last leg of our WIP for this semester, we have Dr. Robert Montanya and Sir J.B. Ignacio and Sir Emer Gonzalez. It will be held on December 15, 2020. So same time, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Well, tentatively, we can say it's December 15. I think that falls on the first day of our final exams. I'm not so sure. Let's see if we'll be changing it. You just wait for further announcement for the final schedule of our last work in progress session for the semester. So muli, maraming salamat po sa inyo at sana ay lahat ay nasa mabuting kalagayan. Stay safe. Thank you sa inyong lahat. Good evening
Salamat po. Good night po. Salamat.
Salamat po.
Salamat po. Salamat.
Salamat po.